Gina, this is Max. Max, this is Gina. She is our lovely co-host tonight.
Hello, Gina.
Hello, Max. It's nice to meet you.
You as well.
So Gina's actually a owner out in Texas of Jefferson Paranormal Journeys, where she runs paranormal tours and stuff.
Uh-huh.
Ghost investigations. I
Yeah, she
train
can
people
explain
how
it
to do
more.
investigations.
So what is it that you do now?
I train people how to do investigations, like people that are enthusiasts that want to learn more about the paranormal.
Uh-huh.
I teach them on equipment in an actively haunted location where the ghosts are really friendly and like to show off, sometimes too
Wow.
much. And so it provides them, it's a 4 hour experience where they can get in, they can hear about the paranormal, some of the do's and don'ts, break away some of the myths, and then I teach them how to use some equipment, and then I have a lot of sophisticated equipment around where they can also see how some of the other types of equipment works. Plus, I do investigations for other people as well, and I'm now partnering up with Alex so we can do some of these together across the country.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And
Yes, we're
tonight,
having.
go ahead.
Oh, I was saying yes, we're having fun ghost hunting.
And
Yeah,
we're
it's one of those things too that people are, you're either with it or you're not. I mean, some people, spend an inordinate amount of time going out of their way to prove it wrong. And then there are those who just, are so willing and so have the ability to accept that um, there's another plane that
Yeah.
we can't really explain, and so it's always fun to me. It's one of those things that I haven't had like some. Well, I hate to say that because I've had some pretty crazy things happen to me in my life. Um, and I I think that the way I would explain it, the way I believe in it, is that there's something else. I mean, as humans, um, and as this little dot in space that we are, there's something else going on out there that we don't understand. We there's a plane of existence at a human level that is really difficult for us to understand. One of my favorite movies is the one with oh my gosh, I can't believe I've forgotten the name. I hate that when older you get, you can't your immediate memory. The one with uh, oh goodness. Oh, the ships are shaped like a big fingernail that stand up, and she's oh, what was it called? Oh my goodness, Amy. What is it?
Encounters.
No, not
What
Close Encounters. This is pretty recent, and it's got
one? I know what you're talking
Jeremy.
about. I
Yeah.
didn't see it. My son did.
Oh my God, it's so brilliant. And that's what the aliens in that movie. They talk about the fact that we can't explain it to you because the level of your understanding is too limited for you to be able to understand the plane at which we exist, and that's the part of it that I think that would be difficult. I mean, if somebody has the ability to travel through time and space in that way, obviously our our limited knowledge of where we are on planet Earth at this time, where would you even begin to start with the mathematics and the science it would take to be able to understand that? And so, it would be. I always laugh about things like that. I was like, I mean, even 100 years ago, can you imagine somebody if you were to plop somebody down from 100 years ago into Earth right now? They it would be like we were aliens to them, trying to
Oh,
explain, the internet to them, for God's sakes, right? Even
or the
so,
way we dress.
yeah,
Yes.
The way, yes, I mean, I live in a house that's 175 years old, and yes, it is haunted.
yeah,
And and because I live in Jefferson, and it's such an old historic town, but we get, of course, a lot of tourism, and I
uh-huh.
can't help but wonder because I will hear there's two ghosts in the mill that are they tend to be very catty. They remind me of the female version of the old men Muppets on the Muppet Show. If you remember
Oh
them, remember.
yes, yes, of course.
And I always catch EVPs of conversations with them together, and they're like, "I can't believe she's wearing that. Did you see how And it cracks
Right.
me up. And I have to think about because when I've gotten photographs of them, their dresses are long and ruffled, and they lived during a time where they weren't even allowed to show their ankles. That's why there was mirrors at the bottom of furniture so they can make sure their ankles were covered. So yeah, we probably do look pretty bizarre, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And imagine if that was, a 3,000, during pharaonic times. Imagine, the trying to explain that to an Egyptian, a pharaoh, or somebody like that. So anyway, that's the part of science and all of that that's so interesting to me is,
Well, if you remember, if you go back to your Bible days, Jesus Christ himself had to start speaking in parables because when he would tell them the direct truth, they couldn't
right,
understand.
right.
And so at certain points, he stops because he's real blunt in the beginning. And then at a certain
Yep.
point, he stops and he uses all these parables because it was the only way he could get them to understand.
Yeah. Yeah. And you
And
wonder
so
if that you wonder if that's, I mean, again, Christ is another one of those, to me, is one of those great examples of, had he spoken, well, first of all, he spoke in such a way that, I mean, nobody spoke that way then. That's what made, I mean, that's why the Jews hated him so bad. They wanted another ass kicker like Moses. They wanted
oh,
somebody that was there to rule by force and conquer by strength and, through the sword. And so for somebody that came along and preached, love your neighbor, or your enemy, um, those were words that just were, they were never spoken. No one talked like that then, and that's the part of it that is so amazing, even by today's standards, even by, 2,000 years later, it's still miraculous.
it really is, but you got to take in mind that also comes from a time where people didn't even refer to each other by their first name because they
Yeah,
were so formal and so proper. And now, I mean, I have friends that they tell me, I tell Alex I love her all the time. I tell my friends, because, and I really do, and I mean it, but it was almost like that's coming from a time where it was withheld. And he was opening their eyes to something different, but they still didn't get it.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I love
So
you guys too.
sorry about that, Alex. I didn't mean to take the conversation from you.
You're good. If I'm gonna go ahead and start with the intro, I'd like how this was starting already, so I just stayed quiet. But welcome back, everyone. I'm Alex, and tonight we have an incredible episode lined up for you. Joining me as a special guest and co host is GINA, an experienced medium and paranormal investigator who owns Jefferson Paranormal Journeys, where you can experience true, raw paranormal activity. And tonight, our special guest is MAXX Payne, who has some of our most chilling childhood stories you'll ever hear. Growing up at the Utah State Mental Hospital, get ready for some seriously haunting tales. So, Max, your mother, I think you said worked there at the hospital until you were 16.
Yeah,
What can you
yeah.
tell us about that?
So, I I was so blessed. I was, I'm one of those kids that, I really did have such a, uh, perfect young life. I came from two, incredibly loving parents, and a nuclear family. Still a nuclear family. Uh, which by today's standards even is quite unusual. The idea of two parents staying together for, in my parents' case, they were married for 66 years. They got married when my mother was 17 years old, and they made it through all the tough times, and somehow avoided divorce through all of the rough times in their lives, and made it, through all of that. My mother was. It's funny because I'm a part of the reason that my life is so unique is because I was an incredible oops baby. My parents had practiced. It's so funny. I mean, this quickly, I'm into the sex life of my parents, so forgive me. But my parents had practiced. They called it the rhythm method, and they practiced having intercourse when it was the right time of the month to do that. I'm sure there are women out there who still would use that a little bit, but comparatively, it's not a very dependable methodology, especially if you slip. If you make that one mistake. And that's so funny because my mom knew exactly the night I was conceived. My birthday is October 3rd, and she always used to laugh because she knew that the night that she messed up was New Year's Eve. So that's 9 months almost to the day that I was born. After that, and so it's one of those. I was really fortunate, but because by the time I was born, my parents had already raised 4 children. My brother closest to me was 12 years old when I was born. And by the time I was 4 years old, he was graduating from high school and had volunteered to go into the Air Force. And so he left the house when I was 4 years old. And so basically, I was like an only child. And my mother was very socially progressive, and she started working. She'd actually been working the whole time that from the moment I was born. She took a hiatus from her job she'd only had for a couple of years, but loved it so much that she took a hiatus just long enough to have me, and then went back to work immediately. She worked at the Utah State Mental Hospital in Provo, Utah, and so when summertime, my father worked at a steel mill. That he worked what was called a rotating shift, and one week he would work graveyard, the next week he would work swing shift, and then the next week he would work day shift. So when he worked day shift, it was difficult because there was nobody there to greet me when I came home from school, and there were 2 weeks a month that there was usually no one at our home when I would get off of school. So the only way to fix that was my mom would take me to work with her a lot, and she had the ability to do that because she worked on the geriatric unit on the old folks side of the Utah State Mental Hospital. That was they didn't just take care of old folks who needed extra attention or whatever, but also criminally insane people who were there because they'd committed crimes as well. So there was this very vast range of patients that I dealt with, and I dealt with through my mother. So I learned this level of empathy and love for these mentally ill people from the time I was born. And as you can imagine, those memories are very, very profound.
Yeah.
So
Well, time.
sorry,
Oh,
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. I was just going to ask what time frame, what years did this? Not trying to age you out or anything, but
Oh no, that's fine. Yeah, yeah. So I was born in 1961, and so this would have been the years that I was primarily there was from the time I was born until I was. She quit when I was 15 years old, I believe, is when she finally decided she was going to give up working at the state hospital because she by that time felt like she wanted to spend more time with me, which is ironic because that one of those things in myself was a personal crisis because it was like, well, wait a minute, you've left me alone now my whole young life, now all of a sudden you're gonna start looking over my shoulder when I'm 14 years old, and by then I had become a child of the 70s, the 60s and 70s, so I'd already started partying and smoking dope, and I was that was part of the biggest reason that she left her job to look after me is because she saw the writing on the wall that I was gonna be a little bit more trouble, as I started getting older, and so she felt like it was essential that she looked after me. It's so funny because I have these very incredible early memories of when um, actually I actually remember when I was probably a year and a half old, and somebody was delivering me to her on the ward. I think it was her name was Miss Carroll, and she ran a like a daycare center right by the hospital, and she would deliver me to my mother in the afternoon, right before we'd go home. So she would take me back to my mom at the state hospital, and it's so funny because I can remember the smell of my mother's. They wore those heavy cotton, typical white nurses, you know, outfits, and it's funny, I have this profound memory of being delivered to my mother one day, and the smell of um, her lipstick and the smell of her perfume, the smell of the shampoo she used at the time. And you guys probably won't remember this, but she used this particular kind of shampoo called Prel. They say memory is the most closely associated with your sense of smell, and so I have that's the part of my memories that I remember this sense of smell, and the smell of it was called the Hope Unit at the hospital, and so I remember all those smells and all those kinds of moments. So yeah, it was my life was this was predominantly 60s and early 70s that this all occurred, that it all happened to me.
I
Can
was
you go ahead?
I was just asking the question because also during that time period was when they started realizing some of the conditions in some of the mental state hospitals, and they were there was some mass reforming. Do you think any of that had any impact on your mother's decision?
Do you mean to quit?
Yes, with all the things that were going on, and the
Mm-hmm.
state coming in to do reformations, and I was
Yeah,
just wondering if she was affected by that.
yeah, profoundly. That was especially Ronald Reagan. Reagan was the guy who basically said, okay, no more is the state going to be responsible for the mental health of families. We're gonna stop the old school visions we all have from the television of that era and the way they did things and how they used the mental hospitals at that. During that era, it's so funny. My wife and I talk about this often because, as you can imagine, being raised in a mental institution, the way I was, had an incredibly profound effect on me and my life. You don't. That's not something that you can take very, very lightly. And when Ronald Reagan was elected president, part of his promises was that he was going to, the way it used to be was that if you had a child that was mentally retarded in any way, shape, or form, whether they had Down syndrome or whether they had, any of the common mental illnesses that were at birth mental illnesses, people would literally drive up, drop their kid off, and drive away and never look back. They had institutions where, if, like I said, if your child had, whatever the mental illness that they were dealing with was, you would just pull up and basically just drop your child off. And from that moment forward, the state was now the public babysitter for your child. And not only, it wasn't just a babysitter, they now became the parents of a lot of those children. They would just drop them off. And the other side of that, for example, we had one of my favorite patients at the hospital was this woman named Maud, and she had a massive debilitating stroke. It basically killed the right side of her body, and her family didn't want to take care of her and look after her. So they basically drove up one day and, I mean, I'm being silly, kicked her out of the car and said goodbye, and dropped her off and left her there and abandoned her. And she basically never saw them again. And I'll never forget when I finally got to the age where I understood what was going on, and partly because my mother had this incredible heart and this incredibly loving heart for these people, because their families abandoned them, and so they were basically all alone in the world. And if it wasn't for the state hospital there to take care of them, now it's changed. That just doesn't occur anymore. People just, you can't just, pull it because you have a Down syndrome child, and you can't just pull up to the state hospital and drop mom, go, okay, here you go, you're taking care of my kid the rest of their life. Well, that doesn't exist anymore. And thank God that part of it, thank God that we changed that mentality. But it was a much, much different world in that era.
Speaking of changing, the Utah State Mental Hospital is still open to this day,
Yeah,
but it looks different.
cool.
Can
Quite a
you
bit.
can you paint a picture of what the hospital looked like when you were there?
Well, when I was there, it's funny because we all sort of have those images of what a state hospital would look like, and Utah State Mental Hospital lived up to that look. Originally, the original look of the building was, it was this massive, it was made of limestone, and it had these huge, like, it looked like a someplace of, like a Russian czar would live. Um, and then as it got older, they started to remove some of those facades and try to give it a more modern look. Unfortunately, it's pretty tough to modernize something, that looked like that, because they were designed to look away. And it's funny because the Utah State Hospital was as big as it was actually considered a territorial hospital that accommodated most of the Western United States. It covered a very broad area, Washington, Oregon, Utah, Nevada, Wyoming, Colorado. If the person had those level of needs, that you couldn't, if they didn't have a state hospital that had that, um, realm of integrity, if you will, that had the ability to treat people who were like, one of the things that was incredibly difficult to treat was depression. And depression in those times was horrifying for people, because there were, the drugs that they had then were, incredibly powerful depressants. And we've all heard of Thorazine, and it was one of those drugs that they would basically just turn people into standing zombies with these incredibly powerful drugs. And then they started using some really horrific surgical procedures. One of the most popular at the time when it was discovered was called the lobotomy.
Mm.
And uh, it was it was a it was an incredibly hideous procedure where they would take a brass, um, basically a brass ice pick, and they would stick it underneath your eyeball right here. They would drive it into your skull, and they would use that ice pick to separate. There's a specific name for all of it. I won't go through all the details, other than it was designed to basically divide your brain at this fissure, the fissure between your brain. They believed that if they divided that and split that, that it would have a positive effect on uh, helping with depression. Well, it didn't. It just caused more debilitating mental illness. And a lot of people, when lithium was finally discovered, uh, a lot of people left these mental institutions, because there was finally a drug that was very good at dealing with uh, what they called at the time, uh, this intense bipolarization is what they called it then. Is it, this intense bipolarism. And once lithium was invented, and then all of the drugs that went along with that, especially Librium and the diazepam family, um, there were a lot of people that, when that drug was discovered, left these hospitals, because they finally, I know it's hard to believe, because we talk about that now just like it's a normal conversation. Drugs like uh, uh, oh my goodness, the what's it called? It's actually still used heavily. I can't believe my brain is shutting off.
Yeah.
Yeah, any of the diazepam family,
Yeah.
uh, any of those drugs were incredibly effective in helping people who had intense depression and manic is the word I was looking
The
for.
manic depression is what they're
Yeah,
called.
yeah. I don't think they use the word manic like they used to. It's another one of those sort of politically incorrect words nowadays, and they now have much more appropriate terms for people who were, Xanax. That was the drug I was thinking of.
They
Another,
refer to it now as the highs and the lows instead of
yeah,
manic.
right. That was the problem. And I had my mother we had this patient, and her name was Margot L. Sasser. She's been dead for decades now, but she was an incredibly amazing woman. But because they had given her a lobotomy, um, the drugs had no effect on her, because they destroyed it. They destroyed her with a lobotomy. So she was unfortunately one of the guinea pigs, so to speak, that was, you know, botched. And had they not done that to her, uh, she probably would have left the hospital with some of those amazing drugs. Another thing that they you don't hear much about, but was an incredible drug. It wasn't a drug, it was actually a treatment, was electroshock therapy. And what happened with a lot of this stuff, a lot of these drugs and treatments, is what happened with them is that instead of them being used effectively, because believe it or not, um, electroshock therapy used in a therapeutic environment had an incredible effect and actually did miracles for people at that time. But they started whenever you would use something as punishment, well, then it became something that people feared long before they were even had the chance to be exposed to it, and they had to quit using it because of that. Is an example. They would threaten them that they were going to have electroshock therapy instead of saying to them that this will be have an incredibly positive effect on you. And so that's just another classic example of how things changed. Now those institutions, like you said, they've changed so dramatically now over the years. The size of them is much, much smaller, and the amount of patients that go through there, it's now used much more along the signs of and used for mostly those who are criminally insane and are dealing with that side of it. And the therapeutic process is now changed and is looked at much differently and administered in a completely different fashion nowadays.
How do you think, can you explain, like, from what you saw, how patients were acting before they got an lobotomy and afterwards?
Well, like Margot is the perfect example. Is they would she was one of those people. Well, just one second. She was one of those people that I didn't know her before she had the lobotomy. I wasn't born yet when she had the lobotomy. I only saw the aftermath of her, but my mother would explain it to me and what she was like. And she was incredibly interesting because when you talk to her, you could see what the lobotomy had done to her. It deprived her of the ability to control the immediacy of her emotions. If you said something to her that would have an emotional effect on her, you could actually see it in her face. You could actually see those emotions overcoming her, and her not being able to control it because that fissure that they had divided in her brain would had deprived her of the ability to have a neutrality, where we all think about something and have the ability, if somebody insults you or says something that hurts your feelings or whatever, you have the ability to process it and use your logic to go to ask questions, for example, that were you intentionally trying to hurt my feelings there, or what I mean. She couldn't do that. If you said something to her that hurt her feelings, you would know it immediately. You could tell by the expressions on her face and the things that she would say as a follow up, to try and understand in her brain, what you were doing. And it was very interesting to watch because you could literally watch her brain and the way she processed those things because you could see it. I mean, it would happen to her right in front of your eyes, and it was interesting to watch. I don't know how else to put it. You could, I mean, one moment she would be high as a kite, flying from the ceiling, happy as could be, and 5 minutes later she would be as low as she could be, crying because she was, something had hurt her feelings and she was depressed and, laying on the floor in the fetal position, crying. And that's just all of the regulatory um, things that our brain has to help you deal with those things, those coping mechanisms. She'd she'd lost all of those from the lobotomy, and so you would literally see them happen to her right in front of your eyes, and it's not something easy to explain because without actually, you sitting there and watching her, go through it, it's pretty. All I can say is you could literally watch the frustration in her manifest itself right in front of your eyes.
Gina, would you like to go next?
Well, I was just wondering, so when somebody would have lobotomy, um, when they would have like an ailment, because it sounds like that people with some physical disabilities,
Mm-hmm.
with some people with some physical disabilities, it was not recognized as a physical disability, it was recognized as a mental illness. So when something would happen that, say, she was physically hurt somewhere, how did they treat that? Or were they even able to recognize that because of her inability to articulate that?
Um, she could articulate it, but the funny part is it was always extreme articulation. That's the
Okay.
best way to describe it. Whenever something would hurt her or her feelings, um, it was there was it was like the filters and the limits didn't exist any longer. So it would be an extreme reaction in all cases. And it might be something as simple as, you know, a hangnail would garner the same kind of reaction that, breaking a toe would or something like that. You know what I mean? It the ability to differentiate on her part was so removed from her, that would be the difficulty. It would be like almost like dealing with a baby. How do you help a baby when they can't tell you what's wrong with them? um you know that there's only the extreme crying and screaming out loud versus uh being now not heard any longer. And that was always the problem that you had with people who had lobotomies is the extreme loop, the extreme mood swings would, that's the only way they knew how to deal with that because of what the lobotomy had deprived them of. And so that was always the part that was difficult for the healthcare professionals, was trying to, how do we figure out, and with Margot, they eventually, they learned how to deal with it. And she got to the point where she became very good and was aware of what was going on. So they tried, they got to the point where you get pretty good at managing those situations because of, excuse me, because of experience and just learning to deal with somebody because of you're with them, 24/7. And that's how they would, it got to the point where, like, my mother, she knew her really well. So when something was wrong, my mother had this incredible ability to be able to talk to Margot in her language. So, and it took, it was those kind of healthcare professionals that were good at it, that were really caring and empathetic, that were the ones that they put in those situations usually to help people like her. Most people like that got to the point where they got very good at understanding these people because they knew they were never leaving. They were so debilitated, they were never going to be able to live on their. Sorry.
Sorry, that was
Oh,
my
no, it's okay. It's totally okay. I realized it was. I'm guessing that child. It's.
yeah. I told you they were going to interrupt.
Oh, that's okay. It's totally okay. But yeah, that was the biggest problems, was people learning how to deal with people at such extremes.
So did they have because I know for a while it was so popular they didn't know their patient. They would use the ice baths. Did they still do that? Were they or did they do it at that time where if they were having a
The,
high they would drop
the,
in the bath?
the ice baths.
Yes, it
Yeah,
sounds so.
again, see, that's the sad part. That's the sad part of what they did with mental health then was this is the part about it. And this is where my mother was so brilliant because she was so compassionate and she would not put up with punishment. That just is not an effective way to treat somebody who's mentally ill, to punish them for their behavior. She was a huge advocate um, of people being against. She was one of those people who was incredibly against, you know, ice baths. Again, it was one of those things that therapeutically it had an effect. But when they started using it as when they would start going, if you don't change your behavior, we're going to give you an ice bath. That's when the problems occurred so often, is when they used it in that fashion. And when they did that, then the therapy that would come from that would be lost immediately. And so that was the part that he, my mother, like I said, was really blessed at knowing she never did that. She would not allow that to happen to her patients. And then my mother took a whole different approach to therapies that a lot of people would never have thought of. My mother was a very gifted musician. She could play anything by ear. She could. I'll never forget when the movie The Sting came out and the entertainer. Yeah, the entertainer was a magnificent. Was a hugely was a huge hit at that time. And I'll never forget, we went to the theater. And I love Paul Newman and Robert Redford. During that era, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and the Sting, and they were just massive superstars at that time. And we went to see the Sting, and I will never forget. She came home and sat down at the piano, and she'd already figured it out in her head and played the whole song from beginning to end. Uh, just from she already played it in her head, so that by the time we got to the house, she just sat down and played it from beginning to end. That's the kind of musician she was. And what my mother did with music, I watched this happen. It was absolutely amazing, the effect. So my mother had started this band, and what she would do is she would go buy kazoos and washboards and tambourines and shakers and all those kinds of things. And she would have 3 or 4 times a week, they would have band practice, and she would give all of the people their favorite instruments, and they would all gather around the piano. And I'll never forget, there was a patient there who was catatonic, and they uh, they would literally stand. I mean, if you can imagine, sort of exactly what you would think of as uh, a mental hospital, the inside of the state hospital, these massive windows that were all covered with that heavy steel mesh, so they couldn't break out. Um, there was this one particular window on the Hope unit that this person would wake up in the morning, whatever time it was, they would get out of bed, 8, 9 o'clock, and they would stand in front of that window, and they would stand there all day and do this all day, all day. And I will never forget. I could not wait for my mother to do the band, because that person wouldn't speak, they wouldn't talk, they wouldn't say a word. They would just stand in front of this window all day until my mother sat down at the piano and started playing the piano. And they would go from this. They would go to, and they would come over to the piano. They'd dig through the box and find their favorite instrument. I think his favorite instrument was a washboard, old school washboard that he would use to make rhythm on. And my mother would sit there for an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours sometimes, and play music. And he would sit there and laugh and play music. And as soon as he was done, he'd put the washboard back in the box and he'd walk right back over to the window and go right back to doing this. And it was so amazing. And he wasn't the only one. Everybody that my mother involved in the band, they would all get involved in the band, and kazoos and the spinny things and all of that. And man, as soon as my mom would start to play, the whole ward would fill with just this amazing energy and synergy that was just so unbelievable. She won several awards from the state as an employee of the month and for developing this band. And it's not one of those things that anyone can do, because she was a very unique musician in that she could sit down and they would shout the next song, and especially from her era, they'd shout a song like Babyface or Little Brown Jug or, the Charleston or whatever old time song they would shout out. My mother knew it and she'd play it, and they would all sing and play kazoos and do all of that. And you could always tell the energy and the happiness that put into their soul. That was when I really saw the power of music, and she demonstrated it on a daily basis with the band. That was one of those things that she invented it. She carried it on until she did it until the day she retired. And I would believe to this day, they're all gone. They're all dead and gone now. But those who couldn't wait to see Ellen sit down at the piano and hear those first few notes, they would all just come running, and it would just completely change the energy on the ward. It was like I said with the catatonic individual. He would just as soon as he'd hear her start to play, he would run for that box, and because he knew it was time for him to laugh and have the feelings that musical energy would bring to the table.
They say music does something to your soul.
Right. And it's so funny because I was so blessed.
What were Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, no, I was done. I was just going to say, to actually see that manifested right before my eyes. And even though I was a selfish little boy, I still was smart enough to know that what she was doing it was amazing.
What were some of the most unsettling things that you've witnessed or felt there?
The part of so there's a few things that's pretty amazing. I don't know how they pulled this off, but this is going to take a bit of a setup in order for you to understand this. So there was a during the Depression, President Roosevelt started a whole bunch of programs. One of them was called the WPA, I believe. Another one was called the CCCs, Conservation Corps or something, Civilian Conservation Corps, I think what that stood for. And they were all designed to give the way FDR brought the country out of the Great Depression was to give everybody a job, not to just give them money, but to give them a job, to give them something to work for. And these groups like the CCCs and WPA, what they would do is they would just build stuff. They would, like, a classic example, and this is my perfect example to demonstrate what I'm talking about, is that in the mid-30s, they came to the state hospital, the WPA did, and they built a castle And when I say a castle, it looks. I think I sent you the pictures. I don't know if you have the ability to throw one of those up. If you can throw those pictures up when we start talking about this. Yeah, I know you can't do it now, but when you do your edit, if you can, you might want to show people that. But it literally looks like exactly. It's not a massive one with great big spires, but it has a spire and this massive stone amphitheater, and they built this magnificent castle, and it's built of stone, and it was just a project that was part of the WPA's projects that they built to give people these jobs during the Depression. And so they built this castle, and it didn't get used as much as I think that they had hoped it would. They really wanted to use it for like traveling um, musical groups or traveling theater groups. They could use the they could use the amphitheater to put on, if they were doing Romeo and Juliet, for example, and they needed a place to do it. Well, they had this amphitheater. This amphitheater probably held 2 or 3 thousand people. So they could invite people to come there and see these, and then they did it so that they could give it to the patients, so that anybody in the community that wanted to give back to the patients, you could use the amphitheater to come and do that. BYU would use their theater program whenever they did plays at Brigham Young in their drama department. A lot of times they would just plan as part of the course of that play going on, being performed, would be to go give it to the patients at the state hospital. And they would also use it to give to the general public. And so those artists would come and go perform at the amphitheater, and they would they would they would use that magnificent building. And if you see the where this castle is built, it's literally built right at the base of these gorgeous mountains at the Wasatch Front in the state of Utah. And so this castle, when I was a kid, my mom had bought me this little brown suitcase that I put my GI Joes in and all of my toy action figures at the time, and my Hot Wheels. And when I'd go to work with her, she'd say, "Oh, go ahead and go up to the castle and play at the castle." And so this is where the haunting side of this comes in for me, is you you can't be at a castle like that and not feel the spook of it, if you will. It was spooky. It was one of those places that was really spooky. Well, somebody in the administration, that for the youth program at the state hospital, they had decided that they were going to build a spook alley at the state hospital, and they used the castle as the place to present the spook alley. And I remember this would have been 1974, 5-ish, when this spook alley first started. If you look it up on Google, the information is there. All you got to do is say, "Tell me about the spook alley that happened at the Utah State Mental Hospital." And they will show it. There are pictures online that show it going on and it happening. But I will tell you, when you went to the spook alley as a customer, and here you are at the state mental hospital going through a spook alley with, people in there, reenactments of, you know, serial killers and, that kind of crazy stuff. It would scare the shit out of you. I mean, there's just no way around it. When I was a kid, and we would go there with the Spook Alley, and it ended up being just a massive, massive hit. People loved it because it was genuinely a very, very chilling. It was a chilling place, a chilling building, and the people that run the Spook Alley were chilling people. I mean, that's how else do you say it? And which is the reason in the end that the Spook Alley actually finally was stopped, was because it became obviously very politically incorrect, and people started making that was just about the time that political correctness really started to come into full view for all of us, and we started, the terminology that we used to describe those who were mentally ill, those terms started to go by the wayside, and eventually obviously they closed the Spook Alley down, and they quit doing it. But during the time that it was running, it was absolutely terrifying. It was an amazing, amazing Spook Alley. But all the donations and all the money that they made from it went back into doing good things for the patients. And I think it was really good for the patients, because it gave them a chance to act out and to do these things that they just normally wouldn't get to do. But it was scary, and it was the real deal.
And Gina, you want to go next?
I'm actually at a loss. Why don't you go ahead and go?
Okay. So can you what specific hauntings do you think might have happened at the mental hospital or the castle in itself? Do you think that you've experienced there?
There's an energy in that, for first of all, like the Hope Unit, the part of that is um, the part that was always scary was these people. So many of them that were there because they were the unwanted. That's what I called them. And so many of them were brought there and abandoned by their families and just left behind. They were just dropped off and left behind. And the energy that comes from that kind of thing, it was amazing, is when you would go into those places, you could feel the energy of those who had come before you, just because of a lot of what we just talked about, the lobotomies that destroyed people's lives, the fact that it was so often used as punishment, the destructive nature of how mental health, you know prior to it was criminal. There was a lot of criminality that happened in those state institutions before they finally took a hold of it and changed that. And so inevitably, like the castle itself, there were several times I went there where, and I would be standing in one of the rooms, and the funny part is like the castle had those exactly what you would think one of those big castle dungeon doors would look like, with the big pieces of iron that went all the way across the door, and the great big hinges with the florets, that were on the steel that held these doors together, and the wind would catch them, or this just all of the typical things that you think you would that came in conjunction with a place that, quite frankly, had dealt with a lot of death and horrifying elements. Just the fact of what it was, that there was a lot of pain and misery associated with that hospital. Unfortunately, that's just the nature of the beast. And when somebody's abandoned because they are that unwanted. That's the kind of energy that you would feel often. And those are the things that always terrified me the most as a kid. Is I liked the going to um, the castle and being frightened. It was that moment of going to this old building that all the doors squeaked when you opened them. Everything about it looked like it was haunted, uh, and it was. So whenever it was, it would start to get to the evening, and it's funny, back in when I was younger, you know I come from an era of the way your parents would track you down as they would stand on the porch of your house and yell your name, and if you were 3 or 4 houses away, you could hear them screaming at you. And so that's what my mom would do. She would, when I was at the castle was, it was quite a ways away, but my mom had a pretty powerful voice. And she would just stand there and scream, and I would, oh, it's my mom calling. And so I would run back to the Hope unit and go find her. But there inevitably, like I said, and there were some fairly notorious people who went through the Utah State hospital system. I don't know if you know this, but Roseanne Barr has spoken often about her mental illness, and she spent a lot of time at the Utah State Hospital, and that's where she went through rehabilitation and on several occasions. And so, the energy that goes along with a place like that can be very terrifying. And you just, it's that natural instinct of being afraid what's around every corner, and the weird noises, the weird sounds, and just the inherent nature of a place like that being scary just because of the general proximity of what it was.
And would you ever go back and visit a place that was similar to that?
Oh yeah, actually, I have a show called The Pain Lair, and I actually did a couple of episodes uh, of The Pain Lair. I did there, and then I actually have a film that's going to be coming out in the not too distant future, and we did 3 or 4 of the interviews from the amphitheater at the castle. So yeah, it's funny, whenever I'm back in Utah, whenever I'm home, back in the state of Utah, it's really easy to access the castle, and so it has such an appealing place in my heart. Not just the scary stuff, but the good stuff that we used to do. The state hospital, I have some very, very incredibly fond memories of the things that we used to do. They used to take the patients to, because it was the state hospital, things like uh, the circus. Anytime a circus of any kind would come through town, they would always give the patients at the hospital, they'd give them free tickets. Whenever the ice capades came to town, they would give the patients at the state hospital tickets to the ice capades, and so we would go see that. Another thing that was really magnificent is that somebody who was very generous and had a family member that the state hospital had helped a lot. Every year they had built a trust fund, and they would do, and I don't know if it's still going on. I looked it up to try and see if I could find if it was still going. I don't have the answer to this, but this guy had um, created an endowment that every 4th of July, he had given them a pretty substantial amount of money, so that every 4th of July, they had the state hospital had its own private fireworks. And it ended up being quite a tradition. Not just the public was invited, but the state hospital residents were always the ones who got the front row and were the closest to the actual fireworks themselves. But that's just another classic example of the things that, the positive things that came from it, like the band my mother created. That's another one of those classic examples, the fireworks. And all of whenever somebody came through that did things that would have been good for the residents of the state hospital, they would donate that to the state hospital. So yeah, I don't have anything but fondness in my heart, for the state hospital, partly because of the impact my mother had on that hospital, and the impact my mother had on me, and teaching me and giving me, not just teaching me, but gifting me the incredible empathy that she bestowed upon me, to realize that these people, even though some of them were incredibly sick and incredibly dangerous, they were still people, and they deserved to be treated as such. And that's a gift my mother gave me that I'll never forget. And I thank her for every day of my life, because she bestowed that upon me.
And Gina, if you have any questions, if not, I'll go ahead and we can close it out.
Well, I just have one. If
Yes.
you could, Max, if you could go back in time and face the unwanted during that time period, what message would you give them?
I think that's the one thing that's so powerful about Ellen Peterson, my mother, is because of her, they weren't unwanted. They weren't uncared for. She went out of her way to um, to really give people their dignity and respect, regardless of who they were or what they'd done or what life had bestowed upon them. She always, always made them feel good about themselves. And so I think the best answer to that question, because my mother proved it every single day that she stepped onto that ward, was that there is somebody out there who cares about you. Now, some of the people that worked there were not very nice people. That's just the way life is. But most of the people that worked there um, had incredible hearts and were incredibly gracious people that had chosen that profession for that exact reason, that they didn't want anybody to feel like that there was no one who cared about them on planet Earth. And the one thing that my mother did and taught me on a daily basis was that giving to people who are the forgotten, who are the unwanted, who are, so to speak, the dregs of society, the folks that society would like to forget. Well, my mother wasn't that person. My mother was the person that went out of her way to make sure that they woke up every day and they all knew. It was the part I remember about my mother and about being around her on those times. And quite honestly, I'm not giving him enough credit, because my father, if my mother ever asked my father to come and help her at the 4th of July or in October when they'd have the spook alley and they would do fun things for the residents. My father was a very, very giving man and was he taught me it as well, because he never ever hesitated a second to be as willing to give as my mother was, and he went out of his way to present that same mentality, and that's where I got it from, was from them. And all I can say is how incredibly blessed I was to be born and raised into a family that taught me those lessons, that when people, you can give people clothes and money and anything you want to, and they won't remember that, but the one thing they'll never forget is the way you make them feel. And my father and mother were really, really good. They're blessed at making people feel well and feel good about themselves. And that's the blessing that I was given by my mother and father. And I thank them every day of my life for giving me that gift, because I've watched it happen to me time and time again in my life. The more I give to people, the better it makes me feel. And that's the part of what they taught me that I'm so appreciative of.
I love that.
Yeah, I was going to say your parents sound like very special people. I appreciate you sharing their light.
They were really incredible. I'd like to just finish by telling you one last story, because it's one of those moments, and it really defines what it's like to grow up in this moment. Is there were, like I said, there were criminal patients on this ward as well. And I used to play, there was a guy there that I loved him. His name was Alan, and he loved to teach me how to play pool. And whenever I got to the ward, man, first thing he'd do is run and get the pool ball set from the nurses behind the window, and he'd go, "We going to play, Daryl?" And I'd go, "Yep, let's go." That's my real name, is Daryl Peterson. I haven't gone by Daryl for years and years and years. But you ready to play pool, Daryl? And I said, "Heck yeah, Alan, let's go." And we'd start playing pool, and I was probably 8 years old, 9 years old. And I'll never forget, we were on our way home from the hospital that day, and I asked my mother, because every once in a while, my mother would bring, well, on every major holiday, like Thanksgiving, Christmas, she would bring a van full of the residents, our favorite resident, Margot, Maud, Porky, all these different people that were just all of my mother's favorite people. She'd load them in a state van, bring them to the house, and we'd feed them and stuff. And so Alan was always one of the ones that came to the house. And so I played pool with Alan this day, and he was a redhead, and his skin was translucent, and he smoked cigarettes. And so he'd smoke. He's one of those guys that we've all met, those people before, that have that translucent skin and smoke cigarettes like nonstop, and then their skin would turn that real ugly brown around their fingers. But I remember this particular day, I said to my mom, why is his skin that color? And she goes, "Oh, it's just because, when he smokes cigarettes all the time, it stains his skin." And I said to my mom, I said, "Don't you like Alan, Mom?" And she said, "Yes, I really like Alan." And I always remembered that no matter what happened, no matter whether we was playing pool or playing cards or whatever we were doing, my mom always had one eye on me. You know what I mean? Whenever I was with Alan, she was never out of eye shot. And so this particular day, I said to her, we're on our way home. We had a Lincoln Continental, black suicide door Lincoln Continental. We're on our way home. I was rolling the window up and down. I asked about his skin. And then I said to her, I said, "You like Alan so much, and you bring people home all the time. Why? I really like Alan, Mom. Why can't he come and live with us?" And I guess my mother realized it was time for me to grow up. And she said, "Son, I'm going to have to be honest with you. I'm going to tell you the truth about Alan." And she goes, I think it's time, and I think you're old enough." And she proceeds to tell me that Alan was in the state hospital because he had raped his 5-year-old grandchild. And she wasn't, obviously, she didn't define what that meant to me. She just made it clear what he had done to it to this grandchild was incredibly wrong. And I always, from that moment forward, I always carried around this sentiment. And actually, I named my band after it. I named it Living Insanity. And is that 3 words or 2 words? Because at that moment, I realized, wow, here's this guy I had this complete different opinion of. And deep down inside, she realized it was time for me to understand the truth about Alan. And in that moment, he went from 3 words to 2 words. And from that moment on, I I grew up. It changed my life. And so I just wanted to leave you with that. That was probably the most powerful lesson that my mother ever taught me, and it was profound. It was a hard lesson to learn, and I'll never forget that. And I thank her for all of those gifts because my parents were 2 incredible people. You're right, and what they gave me was immeasurable.
And MAXX, I thank you for telling us your stories tonight. Where can people follow you at?
So at Daryl Peterson on Facebook, I have a channel called The Pain Lair, all one word, ThePayneLair on YouTube. And if you just type my name into Google, I'm not too hard to track down. You'll find me somewhere. And
And
of course, on ASN and Wrestle Shoot with Chris and Rob every Tuesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern.
yes, and GINA, where can they find you at?
They can find me. They can find my other website at GinaLinnell.com, same as Facebook, as well as Instagram, LinkedIn, all that social media stuff.
And you guys can find me right here, which you can subscribe to. So thank you so much, MAXX and GINA, for sharing these incredible and deeply personal stories with us tonight. And a huge thanks for GINA once again for co-hosting and bringing your expertise to help us understand the experiences as well. If you want to explore the paranormal yourself, check out GINA's Jefferson Paranormal Journeys for authentic investigations. And check out MAXX for his lovely music things. And until next time, stay curious, stay spooky, and keep exploring the unknown.